Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sullivan County Learn by Doing Beginner Watercolor series. And we are going to be working on how to paint flowers today, and I specifically picked a rose. That might seem a little intimidating, but I picked a rose because when you paint any kind of flower in watercolor, really the important thing is the shading and the depth of your shading. Where to put highlights, where to put the low lights, where to really have a nice bold, dark shadow to put detail and depth into your flower. And the best flower to really show that on is rose. So this angle just serves really well to show the different highlights and lowlights that you need to really bring depth to a flower. And also, when you do a rose face on for the first time, people tend to get really focused on trying to make the very center of the rose look like that iconic, classic, pretty rosette, but then forget about all the details that give depth to the rose. So I like to always start with a side profile, more side profile on the rose, because it just gives a lot more depth to it, and it's also a little more interesting of a subject because you don't see this angle a lot with roses. So that's what we're going to work on today, and you can do really fun colors with roses. There's so many pretty colors that roses come in, and my personal favorite to do is like a nice orange kind of peachy rose with darker red or pink edges to it. That's really fun to paint. But today we're just going to do a solid color rose so that you can really focus and really see the different highlights on the petals to really add depth to it. And also, when you're doing a subject like this, don't be afraid to have a subject picture in front of you so that you have a reference and you see where the natural shading of the petals is until you get the hang of doing flowers, and then you can do it more without a reference. But I always like to use a reference just to refresh my memory on how they look in nature. So I went ahead and I already sketched this just because sometimes sketching this rose takes a little more time. And you'll notice that this is the most detailed sketch we've done in our watercolor paintings. And when you're doing a subject piece like this, as opposed to a landscape piece, you usually do take the time to really put a sketch together for your lines. And I have seen lots of flower paintings where they leave the background white. You can totally do that, especially when you're first testing it out to see how it's gonna go, but I always like to have at least a tiny bit of a soft background, just because to me, and it's just personal preference, to me a white background, a stark white background, can be distractive at times or make it look hard, and that's not the look I'm going for with this rose. I want the rose, of course, to be focused, but I don't want it to look hard either. So you'll notice also, for the first time I think in our series, I'm taking the time to really go around the flower, and that's because I don't want the leaves I'm going to go right through, but the petals I'm going to go around, and that's because I don't want any color to accidentally bleed into my flower, because I want that, like I said, we're going to have a solid color rose, but there's going to be areas that we have to highlight that really need to be light colored, and if our background bleeds into it, it might not stay that color, and it might kind of make it a little more difficult for us to show those highlights if we have to paint over other colors. So I'm just very carefully going around my rose. If a little color bleeds in and you're quick about it, you can usually suck it back out with a kind of a dry, clean brush, but we just want to try to avoid it if we can, or do the best we can to avoid it. Okay. And this background is going to be very simple. You might want to use a larger brush to fill in these areas. And also, like I said, I'm just going to go straight through the stem because that's going to be a darker color, so I'm not too worried about that, but the rose I want to make sure stays a true color. So there we go, kind of look down on your paper and make sure it's all wet where you need it to be. Alright, and our background is going to be extremely soft, extremely light background. just a little something. I'm not going to put any definitive shapes in it. I like to try to make sure my edges have some color so that the eye doesn't get drawn away from the piece. And remember, watercolors dry lighter, so this will be a very light background. Okay, so now this is all dry. So what we're going to do is we're going to start lightest to dark, remember, in watercolor, because you can lighten up a color to a degree, but it's a lot harder to do so. So we're going to kind of do a general, almost a general wash over most of the flower with our base color. And then we're going to start going on top of it with some darker, more distinct tones. And you're going to notice I'm going to go around the petal like this. Then I'm going to just take water on my brush. And I'm going to drag the color down from where I just put it before it dries, because you don't want it to get a hard edge to it. And then I'm going to kind of blend that in. So the darker portion already is going to start to be on the edge and towards the bottom there, but then we're going to come in with some more darks. So at this point right now, in this section, I'm going to stop for a minute because I'm going to establish my soft highlights at this point. So I'm going to suck some color out with my brush, and this isn't going to be the final highlight, but it is going to indicate to me where I want to keep this color as bright as possible. So I'm just going to really start to put those highlights in. So when I go to put darks down, I can keep sucking them out if I need to. going to now start to go back and put some darker highlights on these guys. You kind of work in sections when you paint a rose. And that's mostly just to keep your hand out of a finished painting. If I was trying to paint down here, but this was still wet because I had just done that, that could, or vice versa, that could cause you some difficulties. Alright, so that's pretty much the same thing we're gonna do, just in different sizes, the whole rest of this flower. Now where painting big petals is a little different than painting the smaller close petals that we were just doing before, is you'll notice that I'm going to start adding some curvature to some of the brush strokes that I do, and that's to show kind of the movement of the petal, like that. And that just kind of gives the feeling of depth and texture to the petal itself. So these are for more open petals. we are mostly done with our rose. I'm just gonna go back in and do some additional really dark, more distinct accents that are gonna be more dry. Where I'm putting these is where I would expect shadows to be, either on the petal or like what I had said before, if a petal is laying on top of another petal. Those are going to be the darkest accents. It also just kind of makes all the lines look more crisp too. Gives the eye a direction to go in as well. And when, like the shadow that I just did there, I pretty much copied the petal shape. So they're all going to be a little different. Some are going to be thinner, some are going to be thicker, depending on the petal that I'm highlighting. The next thing that we're going to do are these leaves, and they're going to be done a lot the same way with just some shading and some tones to them. And then the color is going to be a little different. I don't want a super stark green against this soft kind of purpley flower stalk, or flower I guess. So I'm actually going to add some of the same color purple to the green that I'm using to kind of keep it in the same family. So it's almost going to be like this blue-green color. So this leaf is kind of curled over itself. So we're going to use our darks and our lights to give it that effect. So we're going to, the top part of this curl is going to be dark. And then we're going to, just like in the flower petals, we're going to do some lighter portions, some darker portions. This is all about highlights and shading. Over here, same thing. And then on the stem, it's the darkest right where it meets the flower. Very, very, very dark. Gradually fades down the stem. Now, if you notice, because I have my paint water right here, there are some splotches on my piece, and that can happen if you're not careful about where you put your water. So we're gonna do a technique I don't usually do, but I like it when I see it done. So I'm just gonna, I don't want any right here, so I'm gonna cover that up a little bit. And we're just gonna take some of the color from our painting. We're gonna wash it down with a lot of water. It's gonna be very, very wet. And we're just gonna do some splashes like that. Some more fine ones, and then we're gonna do some big ones. we kind of did this method with the star. The stars during the galaxy painting. If you want larger ones, you use kind of a bigger brush. Like that. And we didn't get any on our rose. And some of the darker ones, I'm just gonna go ahead and pat down a little. You can leave as is if you would like. But now that we added some more, kind of looks a little more purposeful. So now that's good. So I'm gonna give you a close-up of this now that it's done. Okay, so there you have it, our finished rose. And I know there wasn't a whole lot of instruction for this video, but that's because there's not really a catch-all technique for doing flowers. It's definitely more about the shading, the accenting, the highlighting, and the best way to learn how to do that is just to practice and to have a reference in front of you so you can really see where the shading and the highlights are on the flowers, and just practice, practice, practice. And this is an excellent way to get experience with handling your watercolors and handling when to add water, when to have less water, when to shade, when to not shade. So I just wanted to show you this rose painting so that you can see it's really not a difficult thing to paint technique-wise. It's just about learning your paints and learning how they behave and where to put your highlights and your shadows. And that is a foundation for a lot of different watercolor techniques, is just learning how the water behaves and shadowing. So practice these roses, don't be intimidated by them. They look really hard, and that's really just because you're using highlights and shading to your benefit to add so much depth to your piece. So I hope that this has inspired you to give rose watercolor a try. And for more information about Sullivan County 4-H, please visit the link provided below. For more YouTube tutorials or project ideas, be sure to check out Cornell Cooperative Extension Sullivan County on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And as always, happy painting!